And this work is in collaboration with Professors Mike, Jack, and Dougie from University of Strathclyde, Scotland, under the Mission Atlantic project. So I briefly talk about modeling future scenarios of South Atlantic ecosystems from an end-to-end perspective. And I would like to start by highlighting that oceans are under many pressures, both natural and human-induced, which can disrupt trophic structures and trigger cascading ecological effects. And these pressures are complex and often act together, such as climate change, overfishing, and pollution. And in recent years, there has been a shift towards an ecosystem-based approach, as we saw today, one that looks at interactions across the whole food web. And for that, the end-to-end models can be helpful because they integrate the physics, the chemistry, the geology, and the biology from the base of the food web to top predators. But despite of their growing use in ecosystem-based management, most E3 models have been developed and applied in the North Hemisphere, and we have very few examples for the South Atlantic. And here we are studying 4 marine ecosystems in the South Atlantic. One is the South Brazil Shelf, but we also have oceanic islands along the South Mid-Atlantic region. And Ascension and Saint Helena Islands are part of the United Kingdom overseas territory. And to give some context, Ascension became a fully protected marine protected area in 2019, where it doesn't allow any more commercial fishing. And it's also interesting that it's the most important breeding site for seabirds in the tropical Atlantic. And Saint Helena also became a marine protected area in 2016, where only one-by-one fishing methods are allowed. And both islands are vulnerable to climate change because they have a lot of endemic species and because of their remoteness, but their protections provide useful comparison with less controlled ecosystems. So the South Brazil Shelf, in turn, is a shelf region with a lot of millions of inhabitants living along the coast and supports much of the Brazil fishing activity. We have a high diversity of species such as tuna, sardines, and shrimps, but the urbanization, environmental degradation, and unregulated fishing are main problems there. And about 70% of the stocks are overfished and 20% already collapsed, but we actually don't know the stock assessment of most of the species there. So we are using the STRAT-E3 model to simulate the combined effects of climate change and fishing in these South Atlantic ecosystems, and we are projecting changes up to 2060s. So the STRAT-E3 model, I'll be very briefly because we are going to have talks only about the STRAT-E3 one, is an interdisciplinary tool available in our language. And we have a lot of equations representing the flows in the food web, like feeding, migration, and mortality. And we have organisms classified into guilds, ranging from detritus, bacteria, plankton guild, fish guilds, and top predators. And we also have some boxes dividing the ocean in the shallow layer, the deep layer, the inshore and offshore zone. And we also have an overhang zone to account for deep sea without seafloor, which is very important to study these islands because they are very deep. And we can also simulate up to 12 fishing fleets, and all variables are expressed in mass of nitrogen, but we can convert these units to carbon or tons. And in all Mission Atlantic implementations, we defined the baseline period as 2010 to 2019. But we are also modeling decadal intervals from 2020 to 2069. And we are doing that using environmental drivers that describes the physics and chemistry of each region. And we are using 4 variants of these drivers from the NEMO-ERSEM global biogeochemical model from our collaborators. And we have 4 variants because we are using 2 shared socioeconomic pathways, or SSPs, with 2 Earth system models, or ESMs. These SSPs are scenarios describing future pathways for climate, depending on how humanity develops over the next century. And we are using the SSP1, which is more optimistic, and SSP3, which is more pessimistic. And we also have the Earth system model CNRM and the GFDL, where the CNRM is more sensitive to climate change. And as we have 2 SSPs, 2 Earth system models, and 6 decades, that give us 24 variants for each region. So how are these drivers changing across the decades? All the figures I will show follow the same color scale. So the blue lines is the SSP3, it's the SSP1. The red lines is the SSP3, the solid lines the CNRM model, and the dashed lines are the GFDL model. And here showing that the ocean is getting warmer in all regions, and it's getting, the temperature is increasing more in the CNRM model and in the SSP3 scenario. The nitrate concentrations in the boundary of the ocean is declining in both islands and is declining up to 70% in Saint Helena, and is declining more in the CNRL model. In the South Brazil shelf, we have one scenario, the GFDL SSP1, which slightly increases in this nitrate. And here showing the upwelling proportion, which represents the exchange of water from the deep to the surface layer. And in the islands, the upwelling is decreasing as well. And in Saint Helena, it's interesting that in the SSP1, is declining more than in SSP3. And for South Brazil, I'm showing the nitrate come from rivers. And I think it's also interesting that we have one scenario, CNRM SSP3, which is increasing this nitrate up to 30%. But in the other 3 of the 4 scenarios, we have declines. So these changes in the drivers are reflected in changes in the net sperm production. And in the islands, the sperm production is declining in all 4 scenarios. For Saint Helena, it's declining up to 19%, and for Ascension, 15%. And in Ascension, as expected, the worst scenario, the SSP3, has more declines than SSP1. But in Saint Helena, which was surprising at first, we have more declines in the SSP1 overall than in the SSP3. And in South Brazil, this also happens in the CNRL model. You can see here that the blue lines is declining more than the red lines. But I'm going to explain that later. And in the GFDL model for Brazil, we have a slight increase. So the difference between the Earth system models projections are notorious in Brazil. And the trend of the night sperm production is reflected in the biomass of the gills for the islands. And in Saint Helena, all gills of the Strathclyde models, we have 26 gills, all of them is declining in the future. Here I'm highlighting only a few examples from phytoplankton to birds. And in Ascension Island, some gills like benthos and microphytes initially increase until the 2030s, but then start to decline as well. And these losses are cascading through the food web, with the mussel fish with declines of up to 75%, and seabirds with severe reductions up to 99%. And the difference between the models, the projections, are not very high. And we have these projections, they are very similar in the 2060s. But in Saint Helena, we have more declines in the SSP1 compared to the SSP3. In Brazil, these changes in the biomass are more complex. They are non-linear. They don't follow nothing that we expected. And it's varying across the decades, the gills, and the scenarios. But overall, in the GFDL model, we have increases, especially in phytoplankton, zooplankton, planktivous fish, and top predators. But in the CNRL model, we have declines. And these declines can be very severe depending on the gill. For planktivous fish, we have 60% of declines in the CNRL model. And this gill is composed mainly of sardines, which are very important for fisheries in Brazil. So if this projection happens in the future, the consequences will be huge. But in the GFDL model, we have predictions of a slight increase, up to 10%. So we have contrasting predictions depending on the model we are looking at. And it's a hard job to understand why these predictions are different between the regions, between the models, the SSPs. But we found for the islands, through the sensitivity analysis, that what is explaining these changes, the main drivers of changes, are the nutrients coming from rivers and the upwelling, downwelling. So even though these islands are thousands of kilometers apart, we have the same main drivers of changes operating there, which I think is interesting. But in Ascension Island, these changes are easier to explain because the worst scenario is actually the one with more declines. In St. Helena, we have something more difficult, more complex, that we needed to investigate more. And then we found that it is projecting into the future some upwelling peaks in St. Helena in this worst scenario, SSP3. And there is also other studies projecting that with the warming, some upwelling systems like Benguela could be more unstable. And so even though the annual cycle is declining, we have more upwelling in the summer or spring. And so this is kind of mitigating the losses in primary production when compared to SSP1. So I think this highlights the importance of looking at other drivers than just the temperature. But for Brazil, these changes are even more complex and more difficult to understand because we don't have a single dominant driver. We have a lot of different drivers interacting together. And we found that the difference between the models seems to be driven by the nutrients from ocean and temperature, which we expected because the CNRM is more sensitive to climate change, responds more quickly, so it's predicting more temperature and less nutrients. But the difference between the SSPs seems to be driven by the nutrients coming from rivers and also the solar irradiance. But other drivers like the upwelling, dowelling, the fluxes for rivers, the nutrients for atmosphere, the vertical mixing are also important in the South Brazil model. And we found that in the CNRM SSP3, even though we have more temperature and we have less nutrients, we also have more nutrients coming from rivers compared to SSP1, maybe because it's raining more in this prediction into the future. So this is kind of mitigating the losses as well compared to SSP1. So the point is that these changes are very complex. Even though the temperature is increasing in one scenario, it doesn't mean that it's less productive than the other scenario because we need to look at all the drivers. And despite of this all environmental complexity, the fisheries add another layer of pressure in the South Brazil ecosystems because we have some gills like the demersal fish, the mantle gills that are already overfished in the present. So in the future, they became even more sensitive to this fishing pressure combined to climate change. In the islands, this fishing pressure is very small, even before the creation of the MPA. So it's basically climate change effects. But in South Brazil, we need to take this into consideration, and this is why we are doing different fishing scenarios as well. So the conclusion is that the South Atlantic ecosystems are responding differently to climate change, and these islands are among the most remote places on Earth. And like Brazil, they lack assessments, they lack management options because of resources and the remoteness. But I think the strategy framework is a first step to try to understand these ecosystems, try to predict the possible changes, and dispose risks to the food supply, the tourism, the climate regulation, which are very important for the marine economies of these regions. And to safeguard these ecosystems, we will need integrated, adapted decision-making approach, which is very difficult, but I think is necessary. So thank you all, and I also like to thank you all the wonderful people that I met during my PhD. Thank you.
Thank you, Júlia. Very interesting results. Are there questions? Martin, and then Ken.
So thanks a lot. I'm curious about, you saw that the net primary production in some of these islands would decrease by maybe around 10 to 20%. But then the responses, some of the fishing guilds were down to 100% decrease.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is so amplified, the response in these groups?
Yeah, so this is something I'm still trying to understand. But the seabirds in Saint Helena is the one with most declines. But we have very few seabirds in this island compared to Ascension Island, at least. So I think the population is already vulnerable because it's very small. So even smaller declines can be resulting drastic declines. And also because usually these losses cascade through the food web, so the top predators will be the one with major declines compared to low trophic levels.
Thanks a lot.
No problem.
When you were talking about the upwelling intensity, Wouldn't you want to look also at the wind field, like the wind direction and intensity? Would not that be the main driver of the upwelling variability, or is there some correlate of it within some of your inputs or drivers?
Yeah, it's because the upwelling is a driver of the Strathclyde model, and wind and others are not. So we didn't have this in the model, but we have indirectly, because the Earth system model are probably considering the winds.
Yes.
So it's already there, but not explicitly as a driver.
But to reformulate, no one has been looking at if there is a change in frontal zones or change in wind patterns in the area.
For that, we need to look the NEMO-ERSEM predictions. Through the Strathclyde, we can see that, but maybe looking at NEMO-ERSEM, we could.
We will ask you later.
Yeah.
When you read the news, you often hear about deforestation and increased farming. Is it also something you look at, or because it's a general thing here in these assessment, we don't really look at activities on land, but I guess this is a case study where activities on land will likely affect the ecosystem along the coast quite high.
In Brazil, you mean, looking at the land-based impacts.
Yeah, increased farming and such affecting the nutrients coming into the system.
Okay, yeah, I think this is something the SSPs are already considering as well. So the worst scenario will probably have more industries operating, so this is all indirectly affecting our model as well.
Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Next round.